Hey YouTube, Matches 860. Smoking my skull pipe that I made some years back. I actually call it my Halloween pipe. So the few clips that you just saw are from a cemetery here in Connecticut. Very typical of a small town burial ground. I've always been interested in cemeteries. Love to go to them. I always had questions. That I finally decided to research the last few months. One question, the answer's obvious after researching it, but I always wondered how come in all my travels I've never seen any or seen many burials from the early 1600s. Because we know there was a huge flood of Europeans that came over. And there's a lot of old cemeteries up in the Boston area, Cape Cod, certainly all along the East Coast. But I'll be limiting most of my discussion here to New England. Anyway, the early settlers were busy enough just surviving. When somebody died, it was get them in the ground quick, or get rid of them quick. I just realized I didn't tell you what I was smoking. Virginia #1 from McBaron's. There was also a different mentality of what death was back then, and I won't really go into that because somebody else, I'm sure, has a better way of explaining that. At any rate, death was inevitable. It was kind of a pain in the neck for the people that were left behind. And as I said, the first priority was to get rid of the deceased. And because there were no services set up at that time for dealing with deceased individuals, it was left to the families. And you either buried the person where you were at the time, or if you had your own little stake of land, you put them on your own land, marked the grave with a pile of stones or a cross made out of sticks. You don't see gravestones until around the mid-1600s. And I'm sure everybody's seen the familiar scary skull and crossbones that are carved into the top of the stones. I don't happen to have a picture that I've taken of one of those stones. If I did, I'd put it up in the corner here for you. But that artwork sort of depicts the thinking at the time. Settlements, as they grew, set aside land for cemeteries, and that was later on in the 1600s. And churches also, probably more like the beginning of the 1700s, started accepting burials in the church grounds, and they set up their cemeteries as well. So my big question has always been these first stones that we've seen, which are late 1600s, early 1700s. How did the stones come to be during a time when it's almost unimaginable getting a communication to the stonemaker and all of that kind of stuff? So it turns out that the stone carvers would go out in the springtime with a load of blank stones, usually slate, from the 1600s through most of the 1700s. Although you will see other stones, sandstone, limestone, soapstone, brownstone. Slate was the preferred material, though. And yeah, the carvers would stop into a settlement and they'd ask, did anybody pass away since I was here the last time? And they would set about to carve a stone for the deceased. That was an interesting process in itself. It's a lot like calligraphy these days. The setup time for figuring out how to get all the information on the stone so that it was centered and proper took the most time. A good carver could probably whip out the words on the stone in no time. But you may run across stones where vowels are dropped, or it appears that a word isn't spelled properly. That usually had to do with the fact that the carver couldn't get everything on the stone that he wanted to. Opted for a nice looking stone instead of proper spelling. Unfortunately, slate, like all the other stones, come in various grades, which they probably didn't know about back then. And I think in a way it was kind of like briar that pipes are made out of. You never really knew what you were getting until you put it into the ground and let it sit for a while. Slate is nothing more than a bunch of layers of sediment that have been compressed together. And what happens over time, a bad piece of slate, water will get in between the layers, freeze, and it'll make the slate start to delaminate. And that's how come you see a lot of stones that are in rough shape. And yet, I've seen later 1600 slate stones that look like they were carved last week. The next question that I had, how did they pay for this? The actual colonial money that was put out by each colony didn't come about until sometime in the 1700s. So I looked that up, and it turns out that when the settlers first came to the New World, they used the money from England, pounds, shillings. There was also Spanish money floating around. For a time, Indian Native American wampum was used for goods and services. Tobacco and beaver skins would get you anything you needed too. So that's how that all took care of itself. I would imagine also if you offered the carver a meal, that might help defray some of his costs. The images on the stones, pretty interesting. You went from the very scary skull and crossbones to a much nicer looking but still skull-like head with wings on it. Which later evolved to rising suns and urns and willow trees. And again, this is all, it all stems out of whatever was going on in society and the church at the time. An interesting study in itself. I think I mentioned the slate stones were still the preferred material until the 1800s, when a lot of marble was used. I'm sure everybody's seen marble stones. They were used quite a bit. And then it was found that the marble, depending on the grade of that as well, didn't do well with the weather. And you'll see marble stones that looks like somebody took a wire brush to them, and you can still read them in most cases, but they just didn't do well. The letters weren't as crisp. Of course, from marble around the industrial age, late 1800s, early 1900s, granite was the preferred material, and still is really today. There's all sorts of things that they've been able to do with that. Another interesting sideline. If you happen to die in the winter time in New England, nobody wanted to dig a hole. Most cemeteries had a holding spot that was an underground vault. I know I have a picture of that I'll put up. Now, of course, they just use propane torches and whatnot, thaw the ground up, and they use a front-end digging machine. But I hope some of that information helps you out if you're walking through an old cemetery, looking at slate stones, wondering why they're falling apart, or you see a marble stone, you can pretty much date it just by looking at it without checking the date on the stone. Lots of fun. So that's my little talk about cemeteries. Thanks an awful lot for joining me. Take it easy.